What would you do if the very people you trusted to respect you threw you to the ground, laughed in your face, and called you a nobody? On your own $200 million yacht, they call you worthless, a nobody, a thief, never realizing they're humiliating the very woman who owns it all. Tonight, Sophia Monroe steps onto her own yacht as a stranger, only to be thrown to the ground and treated like trash. But when the truth surfaces, their world will shatter in ways they never saw coming. What happens when the monster you tried to bury rises from the depths stronger than ever? Brace yourself. This is not just a story. It's a reckoning. The yacht loomed like a floating palace against the shimmering blue sea, its decks gleaming under the midday sun, dripping with wealth, elegance, and power. Sophia Monroe stepped onto the gangway, her simple white sundress fluttering around her legs, her sandals scuffed from too many summers walking the same city streets. Around her, the guests glided past in silk gowns and designer suits, their diamond-studded jewelry flashing like knives in the sunlight. Eyes locked onto Sophia, heads turned, whispers hissed like venomous snakes slithering through the crowd. Who let her in here? A woman in a plunging gold gown muttered, her red-painted lips twisting into a sneer. Probably a stowaway, her friend snickered, tipping back her champagne flute. Sophia kept her eyes forward, spine straight, each step heavy as she climbed onto the yacht's VIP deck. The music thumped, the glasses clinked, and the air reeked of expensive cologne and entitlement. Waiters in crisp white uniforms moved gracefully through the crowd, offering trays of caviar and champagne to guests who didn't even glance their way. Sophia paused, scanning the crowd, her eyes searching for a familiar face, but all she found were sneers, smirks, and rolling eyes. A security guard, thick-necked and barrel-chested, materialized in front of her, his eyes raking over her from head to toe with barely concealed disdain. "Miss, can I see your invitation?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension, as though he already knew she didn't have one. Sophia reached into her handbag, her fingers brushing the crumpled paper inside. She pulled it out, her hand shaking as she handed it to him. The guard snatched it, scanning the paper with a dramatic sigh before glancing back at Sophia. "You sure you're in the right place?" he said, his brow arching, his lips twitching with a cruel smile. "This is the VIP deck." Sophia nodded, her jaw clenched, her pulse throbbing in her ears. "I know," she said, her voice calm, controlled, belying the fire burning beneath her skin. "Everything seems fine here," the guard said, handing back the paper. "But try not to get in anyone's way. Okay?" He leaned closer, his cologne suffocating his voice, a venomous whisper. "People paid a lot of money to be here." Sophia forced a smile, her jaw aching, her heart slamming against her ribcage. "I understand," she said, tucking the paper back into her bag. As she stepped forward, a woman in a glittering red dress, sashayed by her perfume, a choking cloud of roses and wealth. "Did you see her shoes?" she said to her companion, her voice pitched just loud enough for Sophia to hear. "Looks like they came from a dumpster." Her friend laughed, a high, sharp sound that cut through the air like shattered glass. Sophia's cheeks burned, her eyes stinging as she kept her head down, her steps quickening as she made her way to a corner of the deck, her back pressed against the railing. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, sparkling and vast, as the voices behind her grew louder, their laughter a crushing tide that threatened to drag her under. And in that moment, as the world around her sneered and mocked and jeered, Sophia tightened her grip on the railing, her knuckles white, her jaw clenched, because they had no idea who she was, and they had no idea what was coming. The sun dipped lower, casting the deck in a golden glow as the music thumped louder, champagne glasses clinking like distant gunfire. Sophia stood by the railing, her eyes fixed on the waves crashing against the hull, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Behind her, the laughter grew sharper, each snicker a blade slicing through her skin. "Did you see the way she's dressed?" A brunette in a plunging emerald gown drawled, her lips curling, as she eyed Sophia up and down like she was a stain on an expensive carpet. "Who invited the charity case?" Her friend, a man in a navy blazer with a smirk that dripped with cruelty, leaned in closer. "Maybe she's the entertainment," he said, lifting his phone to snap a photo. "Or the maid." The two burst into laughter, their voices like nails on glass. Sophia's shoulders tensed, her fingers tightening around the railing until her knuckles went white. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stare straight ahead, the ocean a blur beneath her glassy eyes. A waiter in a crisp white shirt brushed past her, balancing a tray of glittering champagne flutes. Sophia's lips were dry, her throat parched, but when she reached out to grab one, the waiter's eyes flicked over her with a sneer. "Sorry," he said, yanking the tray away before she could touch it. "These are for guests only." A ripple of laughter erupted from the group. Nearby, their faces twisted in cruel amusement as Sophia's hand fell back to her side, empty, shaking. The blonde in the red dress from earlier strutted by her heels, clicking against the deck like a countdown to something inevitable. "You lost, sweetheart," she said, stopping just inches away from Sophia, her eyes flashing with malice. "Or are you just here to steal someone's purse?" Sophia's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Her eyes fixed on the horizon, the wind whipping through her hair as the words pummeled her like fists. The blonde stepped closer, her perfume cloying, suffocating. "You know?" She said, her voice dripping with condescension. "If you're looking for a handout, the staff quarters are down below. Maybe they can spare some scraps." Another wave of laughter, sharper this time, more vicious. The brunette from before held up her phone, the screen angled towards Sophia as she recorded, her eyes gleaming with malicious glee. "Smile for the camera. Cinderella," she sneered. "Maybe if you're lucky, Prince Charming will fish you out of the ocean after we toss you overboard." Sophia's face burned, the tears prickling behind her eyes like needles, her fists clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. The guests laughed harder, their voices rising, echoing, drowning her in a sea of cruel faces, each one a mask of smug satisfaction. And as the yacht sailed farther from the shore, the lights of the city fading behind them, Sophia stood trapped on that deck, surrounded by sharks in silk and diamonds, each one circling closer, ready to sink their teeth in. And all she could do was hold her ground. Her chin lifted, her spine straight, the only armor she had left. The sun sank lower, bleeding red and gold across the horizon as the party reached its fever pitch. The music pulsed louder, the laughter more raucous, the scent of expensive cigars and champagne mingling thickly in the air. Sophia stood alone by the railing, her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on the darkening sea. But there was no escaping them now. The blonde in the red dress, her stilettos clicking like a metronome of malice, strutted towards Sophia. A wicked grin slashed across her crimson lips. "Hey, Cinderella!" She cooed, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of everyone nearby. Heads turned, eyes zeroing in on Sophia like vultures circling a wounded animal. The blonde stepped closer, invading Sophia's space, her perfume a suffocating cloud. "You're making the place look cheap," she sneered, her manicured hand reaching out to flick at the frayed hem of Sophia's dress. "Did you steal that from a thrift store?" Laughter erupted behind them, sharp and cutting. The brunette in emerald raised her phone, recording every second, her eyes gleaming with vicious delight. "Yeah, maybe she's here to give us a fashion show," she jeered, zooming in on Sophia's flush-stricken face. "Or maybe she's here to clean the bathrooms," the man in the navy blazer quipped, tipping back his glass of champagne and letting the golden liquid slosh over the rim. "You know, blend in with the other staff." The crowd roared with laughter, some doubling over others, clinking glasses as if they'd just heard the world's funniest joke. Sophia's fists trembled at her sides, her breath coming in short, jagged bursts. But she refused to cry, refused to give them the satisfaction. Not here. Not now. "Excuse me, miss." A deep, mocking voice boomed from behind her. Sophia whipped around to see a security guard towering over her, his face set in a mask of arrogant authority. "We've had some complaints," he said, crossing his thick arms over his barrel chest. "Guests are saying you're disturbing the party." Sophia's mouth dropped open, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I'm not—" "Look at her." The blonde cut in her voice, a venomous purr. "She doesn't belong here. I bet she's a stowaway." "Yeah," the man in the blazer chimed in, eyes glittering. "Probably snuck on board hoping to snag some rich guy's wallet." The crowd erupted again, the laughter swelling like a tidal wave, crashing over Sophia, drowning her. The security guard stepped closer, his bulk blocking out the sun, casting a long, ominous shadow over her. "You need to leave," he said, grabbing her arm with a grip like a vice. "Now!" "Wait, please!" Sophia choked, her voice trembling as the guard's fingers dug into her skin. "You don't understand." "Oh, we understand perfectly," the brunette in emerald sneered, still filming her phone, trained on Sophia's stricken face. "We understand that you're a nobody trying to pretend she's something. "Get her out of here," the blonde said, smirking, as she took a long, slow sip of champagne. "She's ruining the view." The guard yanked Sophia forward, his fingers biting into her arm as he dragged her toward the exit, the jeers and taunts following her like a swarm of angry wasps. Phones flashed, cameras recorded, cruel laughter echoed in her ears as the entire deck watched her humiliation unfold, their eyes glittering with delighted malice. "Look at her," someone shouted. "Probably doesn't even know how to swim. Maybe we should toss her overboard." Another voice howled, and the crowd howled with laughter, their faces blurring through Sophia's tears. Sophia stumbled forward, her knees weak, her vision swimming as the guard shoved her toward the railing. The sea churned beneath her, dark and endless, as the guard's grip tightened, his hot breath hitting her ear. "You don't belong here," he hissed, his voice low, cold and final. And as Sophia's back hit the cold metal railing, her world spinning, the yacht rocking beneath her feet, one thought thundered through her mind. "They have no idea who I am. Not yet. But they're about to." Before Sophia could catch her breath, a thunderous voice boomed across the deck, slicing through the cruel laughter like a blade. "Let her go!" The crowd fell silent, every head snapping toward the upper deck, where a man stood tall and imposing, his tailored suit sharp as a knife, his expression dark as a storm. Victor Monroe, the CEO of the Monroe shipping empire, the man who owned the very yacht they were standing on, the man who owned almost every yacht in the harbor, the man who was Sophia's father. The security guard's grip went slack, his hand falling away from Sophia's arm as if it had burned him. The blonde in the red dress gasped, her glass slipping from her hand and shattering against the deck. The brunette with the phone froze, her eyes wide, her mouth hanging open as her fingers hovered over the record button. Victor descended the stairs with the grace of a king. Each step deliberate, his gaze locked onto Sophia. His jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with fury. The guests parted like the Red Sea, their faces paling as Victor stalked across the deck, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden planks, with the force of a hammer driving a nail. He reached Sophia, his face softening as he cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "Are you all right?" he murmured, his voice low and fierce, his eyes searching hers for any sign of injury. Sophia swallowed hard, her heart slamming against her ribs as she nodded. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "They didn't hurt me." Victor straightened, his expression darkening as he turned to face the crowd. "Didn't hurt you?" He echoed, his voice rising, filling the deck, reverberating off the steel and glass like a thunderclap. "They dragged you, humiliated, you treated you like trash." His eyes found the blonde, who stood frozen, her face ashen, her lips trembling. "You," Victor said, his voice dripping with venom. "Do you know who you just threw your champagne on?" The blonde's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air, her eyes darting to Sophia, to Victor, to the guard who now looked ready to vomit. "She said she was—" "She said nothing." Victor snapped, his eyes like knives. "You assumed, you judged, you treated my daughter like garbage." Gasps echoed across the deck as Victor's words sank in the guests' faces, blanching, horror dawning in their eyes. "Daughter?" The man in the blazer stammered, his champagne glass slipping from his hand and shattering at his feet. "That's right," Victor said, his voice booming, his eyes flashing with deadly intent. "Sophia Monroe, the majority shareholder of the Monroe shipping empire, the woman who owns every square inch of this yacht." The blonde stumbled back, her hands flying to her mouth as the brunette dropped her phone, the device clattering to the ground as the screen lit up with the still recording video of Sophia's public humiliation. Victor's eyes found the guard who stood there, his face pale, sweat dripping down his brow, his hands shaking. "You put your hands on my daughter," Victor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, each word a lethal bullet. "You dragged her, humiliated her, threatened her." The guard swallowed his Adam's apple, bobbing, his lips parting, to beg, to apologize, to plead for mercy. But Victor wasn't done. He reached into his suit jacket, pulling out a sleek black folder. His jaw set, his gaze icy, as he flipped it open and held it up for all to see. It was the ownership contract for the yacht, Sophia's name scrawled across the bottom in bold, unmissable ink. "This yacht," Victor said, his voice rising, his eyes blazing as he swept his gaze over every single guest, every single face, Every single guilty, horrified expression belongs to my daughter. You have no right to touch her, no right to speak to her, no right to even look at her. The silence was deafening, the crowd standing like statues, eyes wide, breaths shallow, their once arrogant smirks now twisted into grimaces of sheer terror. And as Victor closed the folder with a snap, the guard dropped to his knees, his head bowed, his hands clasped together as he whispered, "Please forgive me." But Sophia said nothing. She just stared down at the man who had dragged her, who had shoved her, who had nearly thrown her overboard, her expression calm, unyielding, as if she were looking at a piece of gum stuck to the bottom of her shoe. Because now they knew who she was, and now they would all pay. Before anyone could catch their breath, Victor's voice echoed across the deck like a thunderclap, commanding every soul to freeze in place. "You thought the humiliation was over?" he said, his eyes cold and merciless as they swept over the crowd. "You thought you could laugh at my daughter and walk away unscathed?" The blonde in the red dress trembled, her manicured nails digging into her palms, her eyes darting to the exit. The man in the navy blazer swallowed hard, beads of sweat trailing down his temples. The guard remained on his knees, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking as if already bracing for the final blow. Victor snapped his fingers, and two men in dark suits appeared from the shadows, each carrying a large flat-screen monitor. The crowd shifted uneasily as the men set up the screen, their faces pale, their breaths shallow. "You all remember how you treated my daughter," Victor said, his jaw clenched, his voice a low, controlled growl. "But, in case you've forgotten, allow me to remind you." The screen flickered to life, the video footage playing in the high definition, the cruel words and mocking laughter amplified tenfold. There was the blonde tossing her champagne on Sophia and sneering, "You're ruining the view." There was the guard grabbing Sophia's arm, dragging her toward the railing, while the crowd cheered. There was the man in the blazer raising his glass and laughing, probably a stowaway hoping to bag a rich husband. The footage played in brutal, unflinching clarity, every taunt, every smirk, every vicious snicker echoing through the deck like the crack of a whip. The guests' faces blanched as their own words and actions boomed back at them, exposing their cruelty for all to see. The blonde staggered backward, her knees wobbling, her eyes wide and glassy as the footage looped over and over, her own voice snarling, "Get her out of here. She's ruining everything." Victor snapped his fingers again, and the footage paused, freezing on the blonde's sneering face as she tossed her champagne onto Sophia. "You," Victor said, pointing directly at her, his finger like a spear aimed straight at her heart. "You said my daughter was ruining the view. Well, let me tell you what's ruined now." The blonde's mouth opened, her lips trembling, but no sound came out. Victor nodded to one of the men in suits. "Your membership to the Monroe Yacht Club," he said, voice calm, collected like a judge pronouncing a death sentence. "Revoked. Your family's company blacklisted from every Monroe shipping port in the country, effective immediately." The blonde's knees buckled and she collapsed onto a nearby chair, her mascara running down her cheeks as she shook her head. "No, please, you can't." "Oh, but I can," Victor said, his eyes narrowing, his mouth a thin, merciless line. "And I just did." The man in the navy blazer staggered forward, hands raised, his face contorted with desperation. "Mr. Monroe, sir," he babbled, his voice cracking. "It was just a joke. I didn't mean—" "A joke." Victor's eyes blazed as he took a step forward, looming over the man, his shadow swallowing him whole. "You humiliated my daughter in front of everyone, called her a stowaway, and treated her like garbage. And now you're laughing." The man fell silent, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard, his eyes glassy with fear. "You're banned," Victor said, his voice as cold as the ocean beneath them. "You, your company, your entire family line. Blacklisted from every Monroe yacht, every Monroe shipping route, every Monroe-owned property in the country. Permanently." The man's jaw dropped, his face going ghostly pale, his lips quivering as he fell to his knees. "Please," he choked, tears streaming down his face. "Please, Mr. Monroe, I have a wife, kids, please. Should have thought of them before you treated my daughter like dirt." Victor said, his voice a venomous hiss. He turned to the guard, who still knelt trembling at Sophia's feet. "And you," Victor said, his eyes burning with barely contained fury. "You laid hands on my daughter. You dragged her, shoved her, and humiliated her. You made her feel like she was nothing. The guard's shoulders shook, his tears dripping onto the deck as he sobbed. "I'm sorry. I didn't know who she was." Victor's jaw clenched, the tendons in his neck standing out like steel cables. "You didn't know who she was. Maybe next time you'll think twice before treating someone like trash." Victor snapped his fingers again, and two more men appeared, grabbing the guard by his arms and hauling him to his feet. "Escort him off the yacht," Victor said, his eyes never leaving the guard's pale, tear-streaked face. "He's finished, fired, and if I ever see his face again, he'll be swimming back to shore." The guards dragged the sobbing man away, his cries echoing through the deck as the guests watched their faces twisted in horror. Victor turned back to the crowd, his eyes dark and cold as he scanned the sea of ashen faces. "You think wealth makes you untouchable?" he said, his voice rising, thundering. "You think power gives you the right to crush people beneath your heels? You think because someone isn't wearing designer clothes, they're worth less than you?" The guests shook their heads, some of them crying, some of them unable to meet his gaze. Victor stepped closer, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "My daughter may be the richest woman on this yacht, but the only thing she asked for today was a little human decency, and you couldn't even give her that." The screen flickered off, plunging the deck into silence as the guests stood there trembling, broken and shattered beneath the weight of their own cruelty. And Sophia watched them, her eyes cold, her heart hardened, her chin lifted as they cowered before her. Because now they knew, and now they were all at her mercy. Victor's eyes burned with fury as he stepped back, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. The guests remained frozen, their faces ashen, their breaths shallow, their world crumbling around them. The blonde in the red dress trembled, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route, but there was none. Victor snapped his fingers again, and two guards appeared, their faces grim as they stepped forward. "Escort her off my yacht," Victor commanded, his voice a lethal growl that echoed through the deck like a death knell. "Now!" The blonde's eyes widened, her mouth dropping open as the guards grabbed her arms, their grips iron hard. "Wait! No!" She shrieked, her heels scraping against the deck as they dragged her backward. "You can't do this to me. You can't." "Oh, but I can!" Victor said, his eyes like twin daggers. "You wanted to throw my daughter overboard, didn't you? Let's see how you like being thrown out yourself." The crowd flinched some, turning away, others covering their mouths as the guards continued to drag the blonde toward the edge of the deck. Her screams rose higher, sharper, piercing through the night as she kicked and fought, her hair a wild tangle around her face. "Please," she sobbed, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her nails clawing at the guard's arms. I didn't know she was your daughter. You didn't need to know who she was." Victor said, his voice cold, unyielding. "You just needed to treat her like a human being." The guards reached the edge of the deck and shoved the blonde to her knees. She crumpled her shoulders, shaking, her sobs tearing through the air as she begged, "Please, I'm sorry. Don't do this." Victor stepped forward, his shadow falling over her like a guillotine blade. "You humiliated my daughter. You treated her like she was less than nothing. You stripped her of her dignity and laughed while you did it." The blonde's sobs grew louder, her eyes wild, her entire body quaking as she clutched the edge of the railing. "Please, Mr. Monroe, please." Victor's eyes hardened, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're banned from every Monroe yacht, every Monroe event, every Monroe-owned property in the world. Your family's name is blacklisted from my shipping empire. And if I ever see your face again, you'll wish you'd been thrown overboard." The blonde collapsed, her sobs muffled by her shaking hands as the guards hauled her to her feet and dragged her toward the exit. The other guests watched, their faces twisted in horror, some of them shaking, others crying, none of them daring to meet Sophia's eyes. Victor turned to the man in the navy blazer, who stood trembling, his knuckles white as he clutched the edge of a table. "And you," Victor said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm, "you said my daughter was a stowaway. You laughed as they dragged her across the deck. You filmed it like it was some sick joke." The man's eyes bulged, his chest, heaving, sweat pouring down his temples. "Mr. Monroe," he gasped, falling to his knees, his palms pressed together in a desperate, pitiful prayer. "Please. I didn't mean it. I was just going along with them." Victor's face darkened, and he stepped forward, looming over the man, his shadow swallowing him whole. "You went along with them because you're weak. Because you have no spine. Because you thought you could join the crowd and escape the consequences. The man's lips trembled, his entire body shaking as tears streamed down his cheeks. "I'm sorry. I swear I'm sorry." "Your apology means nothing," Victor said, his voice flat empty. "You're banned from every Monroe yacht, every Monroe-owned port, every business in my empire." The man's eyes widened, his face crumpling as he collapsed forward, his forehead pressing to the deck as he sobbed. "Please, I'll lose everything, my business, my family. Please, Mr. Monroe." Victor stared down at him, his face hard, his eyes cold and merciless. "You should have thought of that before you decided to humiliate my daughter." Victor turned away, dismissing the man as though he were a speck of dirt on his polished shoes. The deck fell silent, the air thick with fear, with shame, with the stench of desperation and ruined lives. And then Victor's gaze found the guard, who still knelt at Sophia's feet, his face streaked with tears, his hands clasped together, his lips moving in a silent prayer. "You," Victor said, his eyes narrowing. "You dragged my daughter across the deck. You put your hands on her. You humiliated her in front of everyone." The guard sobbed, his head hanging low, his shoulders heaving as he whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't know she was your daughter. You didn't need to know she was my daughter." Victor said, his voice a dark, dangerous hiss. "You just needed to know she was a human being." The guard flinched, his tears dripping onto the deck, pooling beneath his shaking hands. "Please forgive me." Victor snapped his fingers, and two guards appeared, their expressions stony as they grabbed the man's arms and yanked him to his feet. "You're fired," Victor said, his eyes flashing like lightning. "You're banned from every Monroe property. And if I ever hear that you've laid a hand on another woman again, you'll be lucky if you're only thrown overboard." The guards screamed as they dragged him away, his wails echoing down the deck, growing fainter and fainter until they were swallowed by the night. And then there was silence. Crushing, suffocating silence. The guests stood there, their eyes cast down their faces, white as ghosts, each of them, knowing that they had just witnessed a reckoning. And Sophia stood in the center of it all, her eyes blazing, her chin, lifted, her heart pounding like a war drum as she stared them all down. Because now they knew the truth. Now they knew that the girl they had tried to crush was the one who held all the power, and they would never forget it. The silence stretched like a blade across the deck, slicing through every lingering shred of arrogance and entitlement. The guests stood like statues, eyes lowered, shoulders hunched, the once glittering yacht, now a graveyard of shattered pride. Sophia took a slow, measured breath, her heart still hammering, her jaw clenched as she gazed over the crowd. Victor stepped back, his expression softening as he turned to Sophia, his hand reaching out to her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he murmured, his eyes filled with concern, the fury of moments ago now replaced by a father's raw, unfiltered worry. Sophia nodded, her eyes steady, her spine straight as steel. "I'm fine," she said, her voice strong, unwavering. "But there are people here who deserve better." Victor frowned, confused, but Sophia's eyes had already locked onto a young deckhand standing off to the side, his white shirt stained with sweat, his eyes wide and nervous. Ethan. He was the only one who had shown her kindness when everyone else had thrown her to the wolves. The only one who had whispered, "Are you okay?" when they dragged her across the deck. Sophia stepped forward, her heels clicking against the deck as the crowd parted, eyes watching her, every move breaths held. Ethan's eyes widened as she approached, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Miss Monroe?" he said, his voice a shaky whisper, his hands twisting the hem of his shirt. "I didn't know." "You didn't know who I was," Sophia said, her eyes softening as she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a gentler tone. "But you treated me like a human being anyway." Ethan's face flushed, his jaw quivering as he struggled to hold back tears. "I just didn't think it was right. What they were doing to you." And that, Sophia said, turning to face the crowd, her voice rising strong and clear, "is what makes you a better man than every single person on this deck." A ripple of murmurs echoed through the crowd, heads bowing, lower faces burning with shame. Victor stepped forward, his jaw set, his eyes blazing, as he nodded to one of the men in suits. "Bring it out," he said, his voice commanding. Moments later, the man returned carrying a sleek black folder, the Monroe shipping logo embossed in gold across the cover. Victor opened it, his expression solemn, as he pulled out a contract, the paper gleaming under the deck lights. Ethan Victor, said, his voice firm, carrying his eyes locked onto the stunned young deckhand. You showed my daughter kindness when everyone else showed her cruelty. You saw a person when everyone else saw a target. Ethan's hands shook his lips, parting his eyes, darting between Sophia and Victor, confusion swirling across his face. Sir, I don't understand. You will, Victor said, extending the contract to Ethan, his expression softening. Congratulations, Ethan. You are now the new assistant operations manager of the Monroe Yacht Division. Gasps erupted throughout the deck, eyes widening, jaws dropping. Ethan's knees nearly gave out, his eyes glistening, his lips trembling as he stared down at the contract in his hands. I can't. Yes, you can, Sophia said. Her eyes warm, her smile gentle as she reached out and touched his arm. You earned it because you did the right thing when no one else would. Ethan choked back a sob, tears streaming down his cheeks as he clutched the contract to his chest, his entire body shaking with disbelief and gratitude. Thank you, he whispered, his voice breaking. Thank you so much. Victor placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder, his eyes fierce. Keep being the kind of man who sees the person, not the price tag, he said. That's the kind of man I want running my ships. Ethan nodded, his face crumpling, his shoulders heaving with sobs as the crowd looked on, some blinking back tears, others swallowing the bitter taste of their own shame. Sophia turned her gaze, sweeping over every guilty, downcast face. You all thought wealth made you better, she said, her voice strong, carrying across the deck like a siren call. But today, Ethan proved that true worth isn't measured in money or designer clothes. It's measured in kindness, in decency, in the courage to do what's right. The guests shifted uncomfortably, eyes cast down, some wiping away tears, others staring at the ground as if it might open up and swallow them whole. And as Ethan clutched the contract, his eyes wet, his chest heaving, Sophia stood tall, her heart swelling, with a fierce, unbreakable pride. Because in the end, it wasn't about the money, it was about the people who still had the heart to see through it. And today those people were the real winners. Sophia stepped forward, the golden lights of the yacht casting a soft, haunting glow around her, her face serene, but her eyes burning with a fire that refused to be extinguished. The guests stood in a semicircle, their faces downcast, eyes unable to meet hers, the silence thick and suffocating like a shroud of fog. Sophia took a slow, deliberate breath, her chest rising and falling, her heart hammering beneath her rib cage. When she spoke, her voice was calm, even but razor sharp. You all looked at me and saw nothing. She said, her eyes sweeping over each and every one of them, pinning them to the spot with a gaze that felt like a spotlight, exposing their every flaw. You saw a girl in a simple dress. You saw sandals instead of stilettos. You saw no designer logos, no sparkling diamonds, no sign of wealth. And to you, that meant I was worthless. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a few heads shaking, some lips parting as if to protest. But Sophia's voice cut through them, slicing through their excuses like a knife. You didn't ask my name. You didn't ask where I was from. You didn't ask if I was okay when you watched them drag me across the deck like a piece of trash. Her gaze locked onto the brunette in the emerald dress who had filmed every second of Sophia's humiliation, her phone still clutched in her trembling hand. You, Sophia said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You filmed it. You laughed. You called me Cinderella and told me to swim back to shore. But the truth is, you're the one drowning in your own ugliness. The brunette's face flushed crimson, her hand shaking as she shoved the phone into her bag, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Sophia turned, her chin lifting as she scanned the rest of the crowd, her voice rising, gaining strength, a storm building behind her words. You all acted like gods standing on Mount Olympus, looking down at the nobody you thought was beneath you. Sophia said, her voice echoing against the yacht's sleek walls. But you know what the funny thing is? You all groveled at my feet for years and never even knew it. A ripple of confusion swept through the crowd, eyes darting to one another, brows furrowing. Sophia took a step forward, her heels clicking against the deck like a countdown. Every drink you sipped tonight, I paid for it. Every thread of carpet beneath your feet, I own it. Every luxury suite you rented out to flaunt your wealth, that was my money lining your pockets. Gasps erupted, eyes widening, jaws dropping as the reality of her words crashed over them like a tidal wave. The man in the navy blazer staggered backward, his face white as a sheet, his eyes glassy with horror. Are you the owner? He stammered, his voice a hoarse rasp. You're the one who... I'm the one who signed the checks. Sophia said, her voice hard, cold, merciless. I'm the one who built this yacht. I'm the one who owns it. And I'm the one who watched you degrade me, insult me, humiliate me without a second thought, because you thought I was nothing. The blonde in the red dress whimpered, her hands flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks, her perfectly crafted mask of arrogance shattering before their eyes. Please, she sobbed, her shoulders shaking, her knees wobbling. I didn't know it was you. Sophia's eyes flashed, her jaw tightening as she stepped closer, her breath hot against the blonde's face as she whispered, You didn't need to know who I was. You just needed to be a decent human being. The blonde crumpled, sinking to the deck, her sobs echoing through the tense, suffocating silence. Sophia straightened her gaze, sweeping the crowd once more, her eyes dark, fierce, unyielding. Money didn't make you cruel. Power didn't make you cruel, she said, her voice a low, haunting murmur that carried through the night. That was always inside you. Money just gave you permission to show it. Victor stepped forward, his jaw set, his eyes gleaming with pride and fury as he placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder. My daughter is the richest person on this yacht, he said, his voice booming, his glare sweeping over the cowering crowd. And she's also the one with the biggest heart. But tonight, every one of you proved that the real poverty isn't in the pockets. It's in the soul. Sophia's heart pounded, her pulse roaring in her ears as she stood tall, strong, unbroken, her head held high. You called me a nobody, she said, her voice ringing like a bell, a final echoing blow that left them all reeling. Well, tonight you finally got to see the real me, and now you'll never forget me. The guests stood frozen, their faces ashen, their eyes wide and haunted as Sophia turned, her heels clicking against the deck, her back straight, her shoulders square. Her father at her side as they strode away, leaving behind a trail of shattered egos and ruined reputations in their wake. And as the moon hung high over the ocean, its silver light casting eerie, flickering shadows across the deck, the guests remained frozen, drowning in their own shame, haunted by the face of the girl they had once dismissed as nothing. And now, she was everything. The yacht docked with a groan, the metal grinding against the pier like a final haunting exhale. The guests staggered off their heels, clacking against the wooden planks, each step heavy with the weight of humiliation and ruin. The air was thick with the scent of salt and stale champagne, and every pair of eyes remained fixed on the ground, unable to meet Sophia's gaze. The blonde in the red dress stumbled, her mascara streaked down her cheeks like black rivers, her hair a wild, tangled mess. She clutched her phone to her chest, fingers trembling as notifications flooded her screen. This you, the comments read, beneath a viral video of her tossing champagne onto Sophia, sneering, You're ruining the view. Hundreds of thousands of views, millions of likes, a digital courtroom where the world was the judge, the jury, the executioner. Please, the blonde whispered, her voice breaking as she reached for Sophia, but Sophia stepped back, eyes cold, arms folded, spine straight. Don't, Sophia, said her voice flat, emotionless. You've said enough. The blonde's face crumpled, her shoulders caving in as she sank to her knees, the phone slipping from her hands and shattering against the pier. The man in the navy blazer stood nearby, his jaw clenched, his phone pressed to his ear. I can fix this, he said, his voice shaking, sweat beading at his brow. We can handle the PR. We can... His voice trailed off as the person on the other end hung up, the dead tone echoing in his ear. His entire business empire was collapsing over a few cruel words he'd thought no one would ever hear. The brunette in the emerald dress sobbed openly, her phone still recording her own face captured in the act of jeering, her laughter a haunting echo. Look at her, she'd said to the camera. Maybe we should toss her overboard. The video looped over and over, playing her own cruelty back to her in a never-ending cycle. Each replay a fresh slap to the face. Ethan appeared at Sophia's side, his new uniform crisp, the Monroe shipping logo gleaming on his chest. You okay? He asked softly, his hand hovering near hers. Sophia nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon, the sea stretching out endlessly, its waves dark and endless, a mirror to her own storm. I am now, she said, her voice strong, unbroken. Victor stepped forward, his presence towering, eyes cold as stone, as he looked over the wreckage of once proud, arrogant guests, now reduced to whimpering shells of themselves. "You all wanted to be seen," he said, his voice carrying through the wind like a knife slicing through silk. "Well, now the world is watching." The blonde on the ground sobbed harder, her shoulders heaving, nails digging into the wooden planks as the comments continued to flood in. "Hope you're proud of yourself. How does it feel to be exposed monsters in designer dresses?" Victor's gaze fell on the man in the navy blazer, who stood shaking, his eyes wild, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. "You said my daughter was a stowaway," Victor said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Now you're the one begging for scraps." The man choked back a sob, his knees buckling as he dropped to the ground, his palms slapping against the pier forehead, pressing to the wood. "Please, I'm sorry. I was just what Victor said." Stepping closer, his shoes stopping inches from the man's trembling hands. "Just cruel, just entitled, just rotten to the core." The man sobbed, his cries muffled against the pier, his entire body shaking as the world continued to watch, to judge, to devour. Sophia's eyes remained on the sea, her hair whipping in the wind, the scent of salt and retribution thick in the air. "They don't care that I was the owner," she said, her voice low, more to herself than anyone else. "They only care that they got caught." Ethan squeezed her hand gently, his touch warm, grounding. "You didn't deserve any of it." "No," Sophia said, her jaw tightening, her gaze hardening as she finally turned to face them, her eyes blazing, her voice rising. "But they do." The guests huddled together, their eyes hollow, their faces streaked with tears, each of them clutching their phones like lifelines as the digital world tore them apart, piece by piece. Sophia stepped forward, her heels clicking against the wood, the sound a relentless echo, a countdown to their reckoning. "You all called me a nobody," she said, her voice carrying over the water, the wind, the distant roaring waves. "You threw your champagne, your insults, your cruelty, thinking I was beneath you. But the truth is, you're the ones drowning now." The blonde sobbed harder, her head hanging low, her hands trembling as she rocked back and forth. The man in the blazer shivered, his eyes squeezed shut, his face twisted in agony as his phone buzzed, each ping a new comment, each word a new scar. "You said I was nothing?" Sophia said, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "But today you learned that I was everything." And as the sun sank lower, the sky bleeding red and gold, Sophia stepped back, her hand slipping into Ethan's, her heart pounding, her breath steady, her spirit unbroken, because they had tried to bury her, drown her, destroy her. But she wasn't sinking, she was rising. And now the world will never forget her. The night swallowed the pier, the ocean crashing against the wooden planks like a heartbeat, relentless and unforgiving. Sophia stood at the end of the dock, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon, the moon casting a silver halo around her. The yacht loomed behind her, a ghostly silhouette against the inky sky. The once grand party now nothing more than a graveyard of shattered egos and ruined reputations. Victor stood beside her, his jaw clenched, his fists buried in his pockets, his eyes dark, unreadable. Ethan hovered close, his hand, a comforting warmth against the chill that clung to the air. His presence grounding, solid, the one, constant in the chaos. Behind them, the guests huddled together, their designer gowns and tailored suits stained with salt water, and tears, their phones clutched to their chests like shields against the world now tearing them apart. The blonde in the red dress sat slumped against a pillar, her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her eyes hollow, vacant, staring at nothing as her phone continued to vibrate with comment after vicious comment. "You deserve everything that's happening to you. Rotten hell, you monster. Money can't buy you a soul." Her hands shook as she scrolled through the videos, the footage of her pouring champagne on Sophia's head. Her sneering face now immortalized, her cruelty forever stamped into the digital ether. The man in the navy blazer paced back and forth, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps, his hands pulling at his hair as he muttered to himself, eyes darting wild. "I didn't mean it. I didn't know. I was just..." But his words fell flat, swallowed by the wind, the waves, the relentless crushing silence. Sophia turned, her heels scraping against the dock as she faced them, her chin lifted, her eyes fierce, her face a mask of unyielding strength. The guests fell silent, their eyes locked onto her, their faces drawn gray, haunted, as if they were staring at a ghost they thought they had buried. Sophia took a step forward, her heels clicking like a countdown, the air electric every breath held. "You thought money made you powerful," she said, her voice carrying through the night like a haunting refrain, each word a bullet, each syllable a strike. "You thought your wealth made you untouchable. You thought your status gave you the right to treat me like trash." The blonde whimpered her knees, pulling to her chest, her body folding in on itself as if trying to disappear. The man in the blazer dropped to the dock, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking as he sobbed a broken hollow sound that echoed through the pier. Sophia's eyes blazed, her jaw tight, her fists clenched at her sides. "You thought I was nothing because I didn't look like you?" she said, her voice trembling raw. "But the truth is, you're the ones who are nothing. You're the ones who are empty. You're the ones drowning in your own filth." The brunette in the emerald dress shook her head, her hands pressed to her ears as if trying to block out the words, her lips moving silently, a prayer, a plea, a desperate wish to rewind time and erase what she'd done. Victor stepped forward, his eyes dark, his jaw tight, his presence a towering shadow beside Sophia. "You called my daughter a nobody," he said, his voice low, deadly a rumble that reverberated through their bones. "You tried to humiliate her, destroy her, make her feel small. But the only ones who are small are you." The guests cowered, some sobbing, some shaking, all of them shrinking beneath the weight of Victor's glare, his words crashing down on them like waves against a cliff, relentless, unforgiving. Sophia took another step forward, her eyes sweeping over them, her expression cold, merciless, unyielding. "You wanted to be seen," she said, her voice sharp, precise each word, "a knife. Well, now the whole world sees you for exactly what you are. Cowards. Bullies. Monsters in designer clothes." The blonde sobbed harder, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders heaving, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. "Please," she choked out, her voice breaking. "Please forgive me." Sophia's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening her chest, rising and falling as she took a deep, steadying breath. "Forgive you," she said, her voice soft, dangerous, a whisper that sliced through the air like a blade. "You didn't ask for forgiveness when you laughed at me. You didn't ask for mercy when you dragged me across the deck. You didn't care about my tears, my pain, my dignity." Her gaze pierced through them, each word a nail hammered into the coffin of their arrogance, their cruelty, their empty, hollow souls. "Now, you get to live with the monster you created. You get to live with the person the world now sees you as." Sophia turned away, her hair whipping across her face as she walked toward the end of the pier, her back straight, her shoulders square, her heels clicking against the wooden planks, each step a final resounding echo. Ethan followed, his hand reaching for hers, his fingers warm, steady, solid against the chill of the night. Victor walked beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his grip firm, unbreakable. Behind them, the guests remained huddled together, their sobs rising into the night, the wind carrying their cries across the water, a haunting, echoing wail that would linger long after they were gone. The world would never forget what they did. The world would never forget who they were, and neither would she. Sophia reached the end of the pier, the wind whipping through her hair, the ocean stretching out before her like a vast, endless abyss. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let it go. The weight of their words, their sneers, their cruelty falling away, sinking into the sea, dissolving into nothing. Because that's all they were now, nothing. And she was everything,